thank you for Rubin Museum for giving me this opportunity to talk about Tibet and China in the 20th century. It says the Ming Dynasty, 20th century, and this is my second time I've given a talk at Rubin, and the first time was when we had the launch of Professor Matthew Kapstein's book, The Tibetans, and I had a discussion panel here with Professor Kapstein, and I'm glad Professor Kapstein will be speaking here on Tibetan Empire. Tonight, I was asked to talk about Tibet in the 20th century, and some ways, talking about Tibet century, it's like, you all know the story, and it's you are familiar with it, and we are a product of that century, and everything I have to say will be sort of known to you. So there's, and I'm thinking, how can I tell something new and something interesting to you? And some ways, like, I would please feel tonight sort of the talk is like watching Tibetan Achalamo, Tibetan opera. If you notice, Tibetan opera is a whole day long affair and performed. And the audience sort of just don't really listen. They just have a picnic. Everyone sit there. All the audience know the Achalamo stories. Everything. They know the songs. They know everything. And they just come and go, They just sort of, there will be children crying, mothers breastfeeding, people gambling at the side. But no one cares. The performance is at the background because they know what's going on. No one going to say shh when a child cries. It's just whereas in a Western opera or play, people heard of, watched the Hamlet 20 times, but they're trying to listen to it as though they're hearing it for the first time. And if someone makes this person next to me makes noise, they will shush you and sort of embarrass you. But Tibetan opera, nobody cares whether you make noise. If you want to go out and get coffee, please do so. But the 20th century, you know what happened. So I'm just will be repeating many facts you know about, and how do I tell the story? So I thought about this, and I said, okay, I'm going to tell in 4 chapters, 4 acts. Just imagine this is a play of 20th century, and there are 4 acts. I'm going to talk about Tibet and China. And this act, I will first talk about the beginning of the 20th century, about situation of religion in context of China and Tibet. What was the place of religion in China and Tibet, and what was happening to religion? Second act, I want to talk about development of nation state and the idea of sovereignty, how that shift in Tibet and China. Third, I want to talk about technology, how Tibet and China responds to technology. What technology did they appropriate and respond to? And final chapter is, I call it, development of revolutionary and emancipatory politics and social justice. The second half of the 20th century is all about revolution, emancipation, and social justice issue. So these are the 4 acts I want to talk about. But let me begin with 10 years before the beginning of the 20th century. In 1890, after conducting divination and consulting the oracles, how best to respond to the growing threat of the British encroaching the foothills of Himalayas and the southern borders of Tibet, a great Nyingma Lama from Repkong foretold that the yellow-haired enemies of the faith could be defeated if correct ritual, known as Maklo, was conducted, and the Lagang is built in an auspicious site. The great regent, Demo Rinpoche, followed the oracle's instruction and consulted divination and geomancy from a Nyarong Nyingma Lama, who found a suitable site to construct the temple. The chosen site in Lhasa has been for centuries been invested with a huge sort of amount of power, spiritual power. And in the past, the site stood a stupa, which was constructed in 17th century to ward off flooding of Lhasa that occurs often during summer. And there were many other small stupas on the site, which to repel natural calamities that suffered in Tibet. So that site was chosen to construct a temple, which came to be known as Jebumka. Jebumka, 100,000 statues of Jebumka, Jebumka, the temple was done. Now, people have completely forgotten This temple was built to repel the British aggression in 1890, to construct it. So if the 1,000 statues, the temple with 1,000 statues of Tsongkhapa was built, it will repel the British. So temple was duly constructed and invested in that. Over the years, temple was forgotten because in 1904, it didn't work. The British came, British invaded Tibet. So somehow the temple was totally forgotten, and the story and the folk myths about the temple was changed from Jebum Khan, Tsongkhapa 100,000 statue, Jebum Khan. And Jebum Khan becomes the area where 100,000 Chinese were slaughtered. So we had to vote over British, translated into trampled Tibet over China, that area. So this was one interesting response to the growing aspect of the 20th century. At the same time, it was not that the Tibetans didn't know of the growing power of the British and the Western imperial powers. Tibetans become, by the 20th century, very familiar with the Western imperialism, both from the British India and from Tsarist Russia. And they have encountered through the Mongol Buddhist encounters in Central Asia to the Tibetan populated areas in India. So very painfully aware of the growing menace of the British and Western imperialism. So most of the response was to deal how to ritually repel this. So we have the exhibition here called Faith and Empire. It's about how ritual deals with the empire in that way. So 1904, the ritual didn't work. The British came and the Dalai Lama had to flee Lhasa. And in 1906, the British brought Tibetans and the Qing Empire to Calcutta to negotiate a treaty or trade agreement between Tibet and Britain. And that time, it was very interesting. For the Tibetans, for the first time, commissioned a dictionary by Teshub Ondu. And Teshub Ondu himself describes, it's very interesting, describes as, how does he describe himself? He says he is holder of the button of the 5th rank with a peacock feather, serving Chinese Tibetan government. That's what he says. He says he's serving Chinese Tibetan government. And he has the 5th rank in Tibetan and the position of peacock feather from the Qing. So he combined the Chinese position and the Tibetan rank. And he, in the dictionary, you can look it up, that dictionary published in 1906 in Calcutta is called written Chinese Tibetan government. There was sense of being one. And this dictionary was commissioned by Tsarung. The dictionary was a trilingual dictionary between English, Tibetan, and Hindi. And later, Chinese was added. And actually, Chinese was added in 1950s. It's really interesting. And this dictionary. Now, the dictionary was commissioned by the Tsarung, the Tibetan representative, Shabia Tsarung, and Chinese Amban, Chen Yangting. And actually, it's very interesting. Chen Yangting was the Amban, but when he was appointed, he petitioned the Qing court to say, "Oh, please don't give me the title Amban." He said, "Well, Tibetans don't care for Amban, and Amban's reputation and prestige has so declined. And if he goes to Tibet as the Amban, he will be ignored." So he wanted a new title, and new title is called the Imperial Commissioner. No longer the Amban, he was the Imperial Commissioner in that. So he wasn't long in Tibet, but he was this reflects the beginning of the 20th century, the changing nature of relationship between China and Tibet. And Tsarung Shabia and Yingtang, they commissioned this translation. And what was interesting about this translation, creation of that dictionary, is one level you had the ritual response, construction of temple, then another level, pragmatic consideration. You have the British knocking at your door. Now, how do you respond to it? How do you talk to them? They spoke different language, and Britain had already started to create dictionaries much earlier than Tibetans do that. And for the Tibetans, they needed to learn about the British, and they need to translate. And there you have about the pragmatic response to the growing of the 20th century, need to have dictionaries and a way to talk to the Chinese. And you have the traditional ideological response to China by building temples to do that. So what is interesting about that dictionary, they were first dealing with many new concepts to do with coming out of British law, like civil court, law, court, magistrate. All these words were being rendered into Tibetan. Now, so this process of 20th century about China, it's quite interesting when you look at the Qing officials dealing with the Tibet at the time and the Tibetan officials. There was a comparison. Most of the Qing ambans and officials who came to Tibet actually were educated in the Columbia Law School. They were much more familiar with the West in there. Ivan Chan, who negotiated similar treaty, was a Columbia Law student, graduated, so much more familiar with the Western society, whereas most of the Tibetans had hardly been outside Tibet. The furthest they could have gone is to Sikkim. But apart from that, most of the officials has never been outside Tibet. And so this was a really huge learning process that they have to deal with in the process of language, terminology, new technology, everything. So 20th century came in really different guise. Whereas if you look in China, China's encounter with the West is much longer, and that what you know about the Qing sort of response, the Jesuits' influence in China, technology, development of calendars, everything that has a much more longer process. And Tibetans hasn't had that contact, but very quickly they learned of the West, and very quickly it began to change in a very different manner. But the impact, Tibetans were quite aware of Western imperialism and colonization, and often in the Tibetan text, this is described as big insect eating a little insect. It's all the time, this is how it's referred to, as a big insect eating little insects. That's how it's been described. So they were aware of this power that is impinging on Tibet and China and all of Asia in that. But how to respond to that? And with the growing presence of British Empire, Tibet, and 1904 invasion, Tibet had one realization: the declining power of China. China is no longer empire, it's no longer the prestige and the power that Tibet had past invested. Tibet had always looked to China as the most powerful empire. With 1904 the British invasion, China's inability to aid Tibet, to deal with the British, really signaled that China is no longer the power which Tibet had once thought it was. So it's a very fundamental perception of China begin to change in Tibet. Now, Chinese point of view, Tibet has to be seen in a different way. They begin to look at the beginning of the 20th century as a place of vulnerability. It is a place where its rule is not completely secure. Its position is weak. It could be the back door through which the Western imperialism will penetrate China. So in all contexts, it has to be, Chinese position in Tibet has to be consolidated. And you have in Chao Fang's the late Qing, the last sort of attempt to consolidate Tibet with their Qing forward policy, Chao Fang's invasion of Tibet, consolidation. Again, 1904, the 13th Dalai Lama had to flee to Mongolia, later to China. Then in 1911, the Dalai Lama had to flee to India, again, so this is once the Tibetan perception of China beginning in the 20th century is one of declining power, and when the Chinese perception of Tibet region is a vacuum that China has to fill and consolidate. Otherwise, China will be exposed to Western imperialism. In the past, it's always the Western threat to China only seen from the coastal region, and Tibet wasn't seen. But by the beginning of the 20th century, the threat from the land was real. In northwest, you have the Russian Tsarist Empire encroaching on China. In the southwest, it's a British Empire. So it is a place where China had a strategic interest. The idea of strategic interest began to be established in the beginning of the 20th century. Now, with this, there's another impact. This is the geostrategic development. Other aspect is the enormous impact of social impact that the Western imperialism and colonization had on almost all parts of Asia, and in context of China also. And this year is the centenary of the May 4th movement in terms of China, which is a revolutionary movement. It was an intellectual movement which really altered fundamentally how Chinese saw themselves, particularly Chinese elite and intellectual saw themselves, and how Chinese begin to view its place in the world, and Chinese civilization and culture, fundamentally that was altered by the sort of May 4th revolutionary movement. And we cannot stress the impact it had. I'm not saying that every Chinese became atheists and they didn't believe in religion, but the May 4th movement and the intellectual climate created during the early 20th century in China had a profound influence in the way it's viewed religion, in the way it's looked at religion in Chinese place. And some degree, there was imperialism and colonialism. It was accompanied by accusation of backwardness and superstition. Western missionaries and Western looked to China as a backward, superstitious people, and particularly religion is equated with superstition. And the very term superstition began to be appropriated and translated into Chinese and Tibetans. Before, the term did not exist in the same sense as today we use in that. In Tibetan, we say today Mongde meaning sort of superstition, but in Mongde essentially means anything that's not a Buddhist. It's a Mongde. It's not the Karma Peninsula here. So am I right about the term Mongde? So it's an idea. Religion is superstition. It became very much accepted by Chinese intellectuals, and this orthodox consensus that somehow religion is backwards and has to be eradicated. This is the one. But similar sort of impact, it did not make similar impact in Tibet. Tibet, one would say, the advance of Western imperialism and power did not really impact the certainty of Tibetan Buddhism and civilization, or what I call civilizational certainty. There wasn't in the Tibet movement of intellectuals and people saying Buddhism is superstition, that, all the rituals are superstition, we need to get rid of it, we need to modernize this reformist sort of secularist ideology. It never developed in Tibet. Even this day, actually has not, some ways, certainty in Tibetan civilization and Buddhism has never been impacted even in contemporary sense. Tibetans are so certain, so secure in their faith, in their Buddhism and their religion. Whereas I would say Western imperialism and colonialism totally fractured the Chinese certainty in their civilization and tradition in that way. So again, this is a Chinese scholar, scholar calls this a denial of religion in place in Chinese country. And they begin to make everything more rational. Confucian rituals are removed, and Confucianism becomes a rational, moralistic element, and you remove all these things. So there's a process of what I call secularization, rationalization, and most of all, the acceptance of accusation of backwardness and superstition was they become that. And the Chinese intellectuals also vowed to get rid of a backwardness and superstition. This is, whereas in Tibet, religion continued to be the dominant role. And they continue to use ritual powers to avert natural calamities and external enemies, right up to 1950s. Even today, Tibetans conduct ritual to ward off natural calamities. So there is not same extent of that opposition to religion that occurred in China. And today in China, I would say there is an intellectual orthodox consensus of negative attitude to that. And I'm teaching a course on Introduction to Tibetan Buddhism at UBC, and I have 70 undergrad students, and mostly Chinese students, and they have no language to talk about religion, apart from, say, superstition, magic. It's all the sort of populist community. They don't have any other language to talk about religion. And this is deeply, what I see is deeply, the negative attitude to religion has deeply penetrated Chinese society. And I would say, of course, I'm not saying that every Chinese are atheists and they don't believe, but this is among the elite, consensus among the elite, the intellectual, westernized elite who have that attitude towards religion. So Tibet, too, looked at the Tibetan Buddhism in a very, very negative context. And whereas historically, actually, it is impossible to where Tibetan Buddhism begins and Chinese Buddhism ends. So if you go to Wu Ta-shen and look at the paintings and sculptures, you can not say where the Chinese Buddhism or where's the Tibetan Buddhism. It is very familiar. And when you look at the Tibetan Buddhist temples in Beijing, it's hard to tell which is Chinese and which is Tibetan. That the Tibetan Buddhist temples and monasteries dominated many parts of Chinese cities before 1950. But that was all being erased, so they don't have memory of that. And one of the things in second half of the 20th century, Chinese activity has been what I called erasing of Tibet from China and making Tibet the other. In fact, if the communists are really clever contemporary, they can make a really strong case of Tibet being part of China in an inseparable, much more sophisticated way. But the communists, because Tibet is so much identified with religion, and to say it's one of it, you don't want to be these backward people to be part of you. So there has a process of othering has occurred, and the Tibet become the others. So, and particularly associated with the religion. And in fact, the Chinese sort of intellectually make the Tibet the other, rather than being inseparable, seamless with the Chinese tradition. And earlier, as I said, Techo Undu's dictionary, he wrote as his Chinese Tibetan government. He didn't say Tibetan government, he didn't say Chinese. He said, and he wrote his rank, Tibetan government rank. He wrote his Chinese government rank. He wrote as one position, and he didn't see any contradiction in that position. So, because of the perception and of religion and the place of religion, where it was perceived as a backwardness, and Tibetans being religious, the Chinese perceived as a backward people who need to be liberated in that religion. So again, another thing I want to stress is that the impact of Western imperialism, colonialism in China in terms of breaking or fracturing of Chinese certainty on its own culture and civilization is enormous, where it has no perceptible impact in Tibet. But only one place it did have some impact in Tibet, and that is in Mongolia. Mongols who were Tibetan Buddhists for beginning of the 20th century, very early on embraced politics of revolution, politics of emancipation and social justice, and also begin to change the concept of nation. So they got rid of the Kalka Jutundamba and created a republic in 1924 and begin to dismantle Buddhism in Mongolia. But in the heartland of Tibetan Buddhism in Tibet, it really made not impact at all in that sense. So there's a fundamental difference between China and Tibet in the beginning of the 20th century, where the intellectuals and the state were perceiving religion. Second is idea is that I will talk about in terms of development of nation state and the new idea of sovereignty idea. In 1911, the Qing dynasty collapsed or was overthrown, and new regime was installed. And China had a successive regime changes from the nationalists to the Kuomintang to the communists. Now, Tibet did not have a fundamental regime change. The continuation of Dalai Lama's rule persisted, and if not, strengthened. I would argue that the rule of Ganden Potang, the Dalai Lama, was the strongest during the early part of the 20th century than it had ever been before. Even during fifth Dalai Lama's period, the Ganden Potang's position was not very secure, and actually was not liked or may not be accepted in fifth Dalai Lama's autobiography. He's trying to, he had come to power, and there's the traditional Tibetan aristocrats and the powerful Pama Trungpa still ruling. And one of the Pama Trungpa nobility, their father had died, and Dalai Lama tries to visit him to pay respect. And family says, please don't come. They say, don't come to the fifth Dalai Lama. We don't want you. So it shows the regime was not that secure position, and he's always encouraging himself, looking how can be regime, the rule of Dalai Lama can be established. But as you know, from after the death of the fifth, sixth, seventh, there have always been disputes. There have been great deal of uncertainty and power, and most of them never really ruled for long to secure politics. It's only during the 13th Dalai Lama that he was able to rule in full political power, and he ruled in the longest period in that. That was very secure. And also during the beginning of the 20th, by 13th Dalai Lama began to alter the relations between the Tibetan public and the Dalai Lama. In fact, he became very popular, in fact, much more closer. One of the ways in which Dalai Lama became much closer to the Tibetan public is circulation, because he traveled so much. He had to travel when he was escaping to Mongolia, he traveled through all the Tibetan villages, going through Kham and Amdo, so he was meeting the public. When he was escaping to India, he had to go all the way through to Bhutan, to all parts of Tibet. So he was meeting Tibetan public for the first time. Before that, Dalai Lama was so remote. No public can imagine. They can only think of Dalai Lama as Khamkön as the immediate Lama. Dalai Lama was too remote. But 13th Dalai Lama began to change that in terms of both his travel and his social policies that he began to develop. And also other technologies of the time, circulation of images of Dalai Lama. And that was very important. And there was a brisk business from India in Kalimpong. These Matwari photographers were making great money by printing photos of Dalai Lama and shifting to Tibet and all parts of Tibet. So it was much more certain. Whereas the Chinese Qing and the regime is collapsing, the Tibetan Dalai Lama regime was really becoming stronger than ever before. And that's another sort of fundamental change. Now, fundamentally, when the Chinese Revolution happened in the overthrow of Qing, the very concept of sovereignty was changing. One, from the mandate of heaven to the emperor's head, to sovereignty by popular sovereignty, by the people, representation, the will of the people, notion of a sort of popular modernist idea of sovereignty was being appropriated in China and being accepted. It has to be rule of the people, sovereignty. But funnily enough, Tibet, the notion of sovereignty began to shift, particularly under the Ganden Phodan. This is much more complicated than the Ganden. Tibetans begin to appropriate the notion of mandate from heaven. For first time, they start to describe Ganden Phodan, Namgyo Ganden Phodan. The Namgyo, in the past, Namgyo Gongma, it was the mandate of heaven, the Chinese emperor. But then Tibetans begin to use Namgyo Ganden Phodan. The Ganden Phodan with Dalai Lama, with the mandate from heaven, they appropriated the Chinese notion, where the idea of popular sovereignty was emerging, the Tibetans. Now, of course, the term Namgyo, you can find it in Tenjur and things, but it's a very different usage in that way. Namgyo Ganden Phodan. So, mandate, our idea began to emerge in Tibet. Secondly, if you look at it, 1911, terms like independence becomes to come into, like word rangzhen. In this, both similar treaties, agreement, the sovereignty resting, Dawang, begin to use the Dawang, resting with the Dalai Lama was begin to be written in Tibetan text. And in the Mongol-Tibet agreement of 1911, again, for the first time, we use the description of Tibet as rangzhen. The word rangzhen is used. But actually, rangzhen itself is not new, but its usage is totally new as independent. Earlier, under Ganden Phodan, the word rangzhen is used in context of Chamdo and Tayab. It was Chamdo and Tayab were called Timku Rangzhen. Timku Rangzhen, meaning they are, in today's sense, Rangzhen, in the original sense, it means autonomous region. Tayab and Chamdo were autonomous under Ganden Phodan. They were, because Ganden Phodan cannot point officials in Tayab and Chamdo. It was all under Tayab Gamgun or the Chamdo Gamgun. It was there. But it was part of Ganden Phodan, but it was autonomous. So Timku Rangzhen. But the term Rangzhen is now start to apply for Tibet. And Rangzhen meaning independent. And that was begin to use. But interesting, while Tibet was trying to assert itself as independent, China was beginning to incorporate Tibet as part of China in there. And you have Sun Yat-sen's definition of, thinking about what constitutes China, what makes up China. And they say China is made up of 5 nationalities. There's Tibet, Mongols, Uyghurs, and Manchus, and Han Chinese. So begin to incorporate and constitute. While Tibet in 20th century now begin to think of it as independent, China begin to incorporate it in this nation state. So China shifts from what I call the empire to nation, and the Tibet too there was a slowly developmental concept of nationhood happening. And there were many ideas of that. When the Tibetan printed the money, it also had the Namgyo, on the money, reading the mandate from heaven, implying it was the mandate that's given to the Dalai Lama. Namgyo Ganden Phodan begins to appear in Tibetan text. So there's a very fundamental sort of change the notion of sovereignty. China is the popular will sovereignty, and Tibet, again, appropriating the idea of Namgyo, the mandate from heaven. So this is fundamental push and pull that was happening, and Tibet was also trying to create its own national identity and the ideas of what Tibet should be like. And you have the invention of the army, you have invention of the sort of delegations going abroad, sending students abroad, inviting foreigners, relating to the Britain. And it's very interesting. I mean, one of the ways is Tibet having ability to authorize any activities that related to in the territory of Tibet became very important. And one example is like the climbing of the Mount Everest. From 1924, Irving Mallory's Mount Everest expedition was not sought from any other power but Tibet. Tibet has the ability to authorize foreigners doing any activities into Tibetan territory. So the granting of climbing of the Mount Everest is only given by the Tibetan government. The entry of the British or any foreigners coming into Tibet is now being authorized by the Ganden Potang. It's no longer resort to Qing. Earlier Westerners they wanted to enter Tibet, they asked Qing for the permission or the Chinese authority. No longer Tibetans are saying, no, if you want to enter Tibet, you have to get permission from Lhasa. So this is the asserting of sort of Tibetan independence. So both Tibet and China were in a way sort of competing nationalism, competing. In the Chinese nationalism, it's assertive nationalism. It's a sort of way it's trying to assert itself and being recognized at the same time, and seeing the sort of Tibetan nationalism as in fact countering Chinese nationalism, and they viewed it as not as an indigenous Tibetan nationalism movement, but attributed to the foreign interference. Tibetans, if only Tibetans knew they really are Chinese, they will embrace us. But it's the British who are interfering, so that they don't want to be part of Chinese. So Chinese begin to look at Tibetan sort of nationalism as a foreign. But the Tibetans too looked at the Chinese nationalism as a foreign and a collapse of Chinese civilization. The overthrow of the Qing in Dalai Lama writes in his Namdar that it's like the relation between China disappeared like the rainbow in the sky. That terminated all the relations that ever existed in history between Tibet and China was disappeared like a rainbow in the sky. It's completely altered this idea of Tibet. Tibet now is different. There is no religious ties. And where Chinese popular sovereignty and the overthrow of the emperor, Tibetans saw it as an illegitimate revolution. The rightful ruler, the emperor, has been overthrown, and that's illegitimate. So therefore, it will sever its ties with China because Tibet doesn't recognize this new revolutionary government in China. So that's one aspect that way. So you have totally different idea of nations, and both are aspiring for recognition as a nationhood, and it's happening in a different context. Now, third aspect is the 20th century. Everyone knows it's the sort of immense technological and social change that brought about. And China began to embrace that technological change. Tibet, too, began to embrace this technological and social change. Now, but generally, this is only associated with the elite. It's not something of a common sort of way. Tibetan elites, the aristocracy, begins to visit Calcutta and Shanghai, and they know all the time. And also technology or modes of transportation, travel begins to change. Beginning of 1900s, before, if the Qing official wants to come to Tibet or Tibetan official wants to go to China, they went by land route. It was a very long route. It took us 6 weeks to get to Chengdu by horse and walking. But the technology, now Tibet began to frequent through Calcutta. They will go to Calcutta and take a boat to Shanghai. You can see in the 1860s onwards, Tibetans were going to China by Calcutta by boat. Similarly, the Mongols, Buryat Mongols who were coming to Tibet, no longer coming by camel and walking. They were going from St. Petersburg to France, to Marseille. Marseille, they take a boat to Bombay. Bombay, they take a train to Calcutta. And Calcutta, they'll go to Kalimpong and sing. So they begin to use technology. They're being introduced to new technology in some way, in different ways. And again, we know about print technology, how it revolutionized the social communication and modes of intellectual exchange, and the print technology as a builder of nationalism and the idea of perpetuating idea of commonality, of shared tradition. Although this was not established in Tibet, but in Kalimpong, under Tibet Mirror Press, it begins to bring that print technology, that power, into Tibetan cultural world. And in fact, the Tibet Mirror Press, if you look at it, in the news, it had news from Kham, news from Bhutan, news from Ladakh, news from Kham, and news from central Tibet. In that page, the first time, there was an imagined world of Tibetan cultural world, which everybody read about it. There was a news about King of Bhutan being read in Amdo, and the news about Amdo being read in Bhutan and Ladakh. So Tibetan Mirror Press was a very powerful medium which was shared, and it was being avidly read. And if you read now Columbia University has the subscription list in the archive. You read the subscribers list. You find it lamas from Rekong to Ladakh to Bhutan, all reading the same newspaper. All may have taken us a long time to get there, but they were using that print technology to communicate with each other. And of course, in China, it's the effect of newspaper pamphleteering. It's very well known how much it really created this fermented revolution and demand for social change, complete transformation of literature, culture that happened in China. But Tibet too is beginning to happen. But despite all that things, and 13th Dalai Lama goes into exile to Mongolia and China in 1904 to 1908, and he sees all this print technology that developing in Mongolia, because Russians were introducing print technology in Mongolia and China also. And then he comes to India in exile. In Calcutta, he sees all the print technology, metal printing that Tibet Mirror Press 13 was doing. He befriends 13 and sees everything, the utility of the print technology and what was happening. But somehow, in 1913, he returns to Tibet and he establishes a printing press called Geopolitical. It's the first sort of printing press going to be there for printing of Kanjur and Tenjur. But what does it do? I'm sort of puzzled. You saw all this technology developed, but you didn't see any utility in that technology. And you introduce a new printing press in Lhasa, but you just go on still have the block printing. And the first 5 years of Geopolitical, they had the greatest problem was that there was not enough wood, trees in Tibet to make a plank. So they had to ask Bhutan to get permission to cut trees in Bhutan for the Geopolitical and have a contract with Bhutan to have this Geopolitical. And you will think, why didn't the Tibetans think they might adopt that earlier modern technology, which he had witnessed outside, and it's being utilized by 13 as a newspaper, and he had seen it, but he hasn't adopted that. Why is that happens? So response to technology. And this way, I would argue because the Tibetan certainty in their own civilization and in religion was never dented by the Western imperialism, might, or power. Whereas in China, it did. Every traditional technologies was abandoned. And the Tibet didn't abandon any of its tradition and continued to use block printing to distribute its texts there. And even to 1950, the military regulations were printed in block printing rather than in modern printing presses that way. Another. But also, 13th Dalai Lama himself was knew that Tibet has to be reformed and changed. And he sent Tibetans to study in England. And one of the students who went to study was Mendo, who went to one of the most famous mining schools in England at the time, Camborne School of Mining, and it became a mining engineer because the British and the people made Tibet could develop and deal with the economic problems by developing mining. So 13th Dalai Lama sent this mentor to become a mining engineer, and he did it very well. I mean, I read his school reports and his college report. He did excellent. He qualified as a mining engineer. Then he goes back to Tibet and hires some Indian engineers and goes for assessing the different areas in Tibet. And it's very interesting. 1930, Charles Bell goes and meets the mentor in Lhasa and says, why hasn't the mining succeeded? And Charles Bell's diary writes a very interesting thing. He said, when him and the mining groups went to different parts of Tibet and started to dig and explore mining, all the villagers and surrounding area came and protested and surrounded them and sieged the mines and would not let the mines to be developed. So you have the first environmental protests, that happening in Tibet, anti-mining protests happening in the 1920s in Tibet. So there was resistance to technology. Well, in 20th century, China was embracing technology. There was a resistance to technology that is being relied on. But at the same time, in any society, the first site of modernization is always the army. In the technology, everything is invented through technology. In fact, the Tibetan army by the 1920s was far better developed, equipped than the Chinese army. And you read the missionary accounts of what happened in Kham in 1918s. They all said the Tibetan soldiers were far better equipped than the Chinese soldiers. And the Tibetan militaries were trained by Buryats, who were trained by Tsarist army or Persian army in Tibet. So there was adoption of some degree this military technology. And military manuals begins to be established in Tibet. And the very preamble to this military manual and says, Tibetans will die for religion, but now we have to make sure they will die for their country. So we have to say it's like Tibetan jihad. It has to be taught in that manual, is being encouraged in that way. So different ways Tibetans were choosing and looking at different technologies and how the nation can be built. And China, of course, is far more advanced in dealing with that. It is a total abandoning of tradition, total abandoning of traditional printing culture, where Tibet still continues in that. Now, fourth factor which I want to talk about is what I call the revolutionary and emancipatory politics. The second half of the 20th century is the impact of anti-colonial movement, communist revolution, and also, I would say, social justice movement. Of course, we just today poo-poo communism and say, oh, these are terrible people. But you have to think of this as really, they were motivated and impelled by call for emancipation and social justice. People were involved in the Marxist and Communist Party because the politics of emancipation and social justice made sense. This really impelled people emotionally to doing that. And many people were moved by it and affected and participated in that social revolution in a way. So this is particularly true in China. The entire communist revolution is, I called it a call for social justice, revolution, and emancipatory that happened. So that kind of politics didn't happen in Tibet. Tibet didn't have the same. There were one or two individuals who might have been influenced by revolutionaries and ideas of this. And Tibet began to, there was translation of Sun Yat-sen's Three Principles of People. Some were influenced by Marxism. So there were quite interesting people, but it really didn't make a great impact in Tibet. While this idea of emancipation thought really made tremendous impact and created the Chinese Communist Revolution in China. And with that, one aspect of a revolutionary and emancipatory politics is universal. It didn't apply just to you. It just didn't apply only to you. You want to emancipate everybody. It was in that way. So Tibet has to be emancipated from communist point of view. It has to be social justice. Tibet was religious way backwards. It's a feudal exploitation. So there's an idea of not only Tibet is part of China, but Tibet has to be liberated, emancipated from feudalism. That was a real impact that the idea. Well, it did not make impact in the first half of the 20th century in Tibet. But second half of the 20th century, it is the Tibetans who imbibe the idea of social justice. Now Tibetans have imbibed, in relation to China, Tibet is now seeking social justice and emancipation and liberation from Chinese colonial rule. So we begin to adopt the language of social justice. And that language of social justice comes in many different vibes. There has an influence of Gandhian movement for social justice. There's an impact from Western liberal idea of self-determination. Then there are also Marxist communist ideas of emancipation and social justice. And today, the ideas of indigenous rights is beginning to imbibe in Tibet also. Now, and finally, I want to look and say, in the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, we have totally reversed situation of what was happening in the beginning of the 20th century and what is happening today. Beginning of the 20th century, in relation to Tibet and China, I would say the capital and manufacturing power rested with Britain. The capital was in Britain. Britain was the manufacturing power. It is the Britain who wants to build roads and railways and open up Tibet and open up China. It was China who was resisting British roads and belt ideas. Today, in 21st century, it is China has the capital and China has the manufacturing power, and it's now China is calling for the roads and belt. And we have the totally reversed situation. And today it's the neighbors fearing China, whereas in the beginning of the 20th century, China was fearing the Britain. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Shakya, for this illuminating exploration of not only the political but also religious psychology of that dynamic between Tibet and China. And we invite you now to take part in a dynamic with Professor Shakya by asking questions. And I just ask that they be as succinct and as brief as you are able so we can accommodate as many as possible in the next 25 minutes or so. So if you have a question, I just urge you to raise your hand and we'll endeavor to get to the microphone to you as quickly as possible. One question I have for you, Professor Shakya, because you mentioned this a very important expedition to ascend Mount Everest in 1922 and 23. And there was a film that resulted from that called The Epic of Everest that made the rounds in America and Europe and was a big, big success. But my understanding is that the Tibetan government or officials were outraged at the portrayal of Tibetans in that film and really broke off relationships or damaged relationships between the Tibetan authorities and the British representatives as a result. Have you come across that dynamic in your investigations, and could that have impacted the ability of Tibetans to call upon the British when the Chinese did actually invade?
This is, I talked about sort of Tibetan sort of civilization having not been sort of perturbed or startled by impact of Western colonialism or power. And when you see from the beginning of the 20th century, what happened was the British took films of the monasteries and cham dancing. Some cham dancings were not prepared. They staged cham dancing. Cham dancing, you cannot stage, just bring actors and stage these things. So a lot of ritual activities were not being conducted properly. They were being done as a show. This was very offensive to the Tibetans in a way. That was one of the objections, that the rituals are being not performed correctly and for non-religious purposes. It is not a performance in that. Because in the in the film, I didn't see the film full, but there was shown some Tibetan doing cham dancing and all this, which Tibetans said, what was the occasion? And they said, oh, we just needed the picture. And they said, no, you can't just perform like that. So that was sort of, rituals are not being conducted properly. This was the Tibetans' main concern. It's not about being filmed or shown, but it was not done according to right ritual conditions.
Thank you. Do we have questions from the House at all? Yes, right in the middle of the House, Lynn, if we could just try and get the microphone there. Yeah, thank you.
Hello. Thank you so much for the talk. And my question was actually, so you mentioned the fact that in the 20th century, and even before that, there was an attempt by Gandhi Podang to sort of involve itself in nation-building process, like what technology, modern. So my question is, that process of nation-building, and even in exile, for example, was it a reaction to the post-colonial nation project of China itself? Or was it more like modernist, what is the linear idea of historical progression from an empire to a nation state itself?
I'm not sure I understood you. You're asking a question, are the Tibetans reacting to Chinese? Or
so my question was a nation building project of Tibet, of Gandhi Podang to make a state, from an empire to a state. Was that project a reaction to the Chinese nation building project itself? Or was it more of
firstly, when I say transition from empire to nation, if I'm talking about China, Chinese, I would say Qing is an empire. I mean, the Chinese now, contemporary China, this is a big history, like debates we're having, and they don't accept this idea of empire. They say China has always been a nation, but our idea of empire is an aggregate of different nations ruled by emperor. And the Tibetans can say, we are independent, we're not part of China, but you cannot deny there was a really intricate link between China and Qing Empire. You cannot say Qing emperors had no authority in Tibet. They had immense authority in Tibet. So when that Qing emperors were thrown, and this relation, this is all the exhibition here is about, is bounded not just in terms of military and strategic, but it's by faith also. This idea. So when the Qing Empire regime was overthrown, Tibetan view that relationship ended any kind of relationship with the empire. And Tibet had this trinity of Manjushri, Wabame, and generously Benje Rinpoche, Chinese emperor. Trinity three ruled the whole the empire that way. So if the Chinese emperor is gone, that's one of the trinities gone. The Chambayang's Gongma is gone. So that completely severed its ties with the, but the theological sense, it's cut ties with China, and has to be new idea has to be revealed in that way. So Tibetan nation building is a response to collapse of Qing, definitely, and it's also ideas that were learning from Mongols, they were learning from Buddhists, they were learning from other Tibetans living in the periphery, that their travels, what nation is required to have. Yeah. But also it was not a universalist idea that accepted.
Who else would like to ask a question? Yes, we have, Lynn, can we have the microphone right over here, please? Thanks so much. Just to this gentleman here. Thank you. And anybody else would like to venture? Yeah, also, right, that's easy.
Thank you for speaking. I'm just curious, what, if any, impacted the Second World War and Japan's occupation of large parts of China have on Tibetan-Chinese relations, as well as Tibet's emerging statehood?
Yeah, it's very interesting. It's a fundamental actually question. It's very important. But most Tibetans and historians don't look at take this into account. And I compared why did Mongolia achieve independence and Tibet didn't achieve independence after 1911. And I looked at the historical source, and it's something to way Tibetans and Mongols responsible for the Japanese occupation of China. Mongols said Japanese occupation of China is illegal, and we will fight for China. We will go and contribute to expel China. We will not aid. Tibetans sided with the Japanese. Tibetans sided with the Japanese. So that in Chinese said, Mongols' independence can be trusted, Tibetan independence cannot be trusted. That's how different it is made. So the choice, That's why Mongolia was willing to, China was willing to accept Mongolian independence, even though Russian pressure and all that. But it was less of a threat because when China needs it, Mongolia will come to China's aid. Tibet will not. Tibet will side with Japanese. That is the one problem. Yeah. So it really made a difference in the way Chinese elite saw it.
Thank you. Yes, next question.
Two questions. First question, so from 13 to like 45, how did Tsering Shakya from Republic of China and then Mao himself view Tibet differently? Like, what are the key differences in the way they saw Tibet? I mean, you said Mao wanted to emancipate Tibet, right, from religion and all the other cultural backwardness that he described. But how did Republic of China, during the Civil War, how did they view Tibet, or were they too distracted with the Civil War that lasted, I don't know, 20 years?
On the question of Tibet being part of China, actually, it's ultimately about question of sovereignty is being, but it's Mao or China, Chiang Kai-shek, it's different. But in the communists, there's a huge evolution. If you read the communist constitution and literature from 1927, 28, early communists believed in right of succession. Nationalities can succeed and declare independent. They adopted very much Soviet line idea that nationality can succeed. And right up to 1930s, communist constitutions had that idea of succeeding, nationalities can succeed. Was accepted. But this communists begin to change later. Whereas the Kuomintang never had that idea that nationalities can succeed from China. So there is different. Other idea is Kuomintang's, they really did not sought social reform. They did not want to. In fact, they engaged actively what I call the more or less the Qing policy of recruiting local Tibetans and Kham and Amdo and putting them in the nationalist parliament. They didn't have election. They just said the chieftains can just automatically got a seat in the national parliament. And it went on in Taiwan until 1980s. The Khmer chieftains can have a seat in the things, and Tibetan aristocrats can have a seat in Taiwanese parliament. So this idea of that representation was very different. And the Kuomintang didn't really interfere in the sort of social movements, the changes in Tibet. They were not revolution or emancipatory, didn't have the imbibe this idea of social justice, where the communists definitely wanted to social change. The communists were very early on were impelled by this ideology of emancipation. That's very different from nationalists and communists.
Second question.
My second question is, so during the Cold War, so what I read in one of late Professor Dawano's book was one of the theory behind China being so adamant on rewriting history and claiming that Tibet has always been part of China since time immemorial is because during the Cold War, they were funding a lot of communist revolutions across the world, and they didn't want to be seen as hypocrites. Right? They're encouraging other countries to fight colonialism and fight for independence, but at the same time, they're in Tibet, colonizing Tibet, right? So they had to kind of rewrite history to claim that we are not hypocrites, and to get that story, flowing, they had to sort of rewrite and claim that Tibet has always been part of Tibet. In that way, they can justify funding other, independence in Africa and Latin America, while also, claiming to not be a colonialist themselves. So what is your view on that? Is that something you also...
This is a contradiction of all anti-colonial and modern nation-state formation in Asia. All the countries, India claims it's a territorial boundary of India is what British had. What about the British rule? It belongs to India. that's fictitious, If the Britain India is going to be anti-colonial movement and Nagaland wants to be independent, why are Indians opposed to Nagaland succeeding or Mizoram? But no Indian regime ever ruled Mizoram or Nagaland. It's only under British rule they became part of Britain. So, and all colonial movement always looks at the territory or border which its empire ruled largest and said that's the boundary of its territory. So all nation states do that. Nigeria, almost all the territorial boundaries of modern nation states are established by Western colonial powers. It's not formation, evolutionary formation of these countries in a way. So similarly, Chinese have two sort of attitudes. One I call the sophisticated attitude. It's not by professional Chinese historians. They don't say that Tibet is part of China from the ancient time. I mean, that's a more sophisticated. That's out there propaganda through Global Times sort of writing. That is rhetoric. But Chinese historians, they do accept Tibet. So during the Yuan period, they look at it from the Qing period. What you hear in the press, Tibet is all integral part of China, since everything, that's one sort of rhetoric aspect of it. But then there is a scholarly writing and discussions in Chinese history that is very different, and also. Yeah.
Thank you.
That's part of the propaganda.
Yeah.
Who else would like to venture forward while we still have a little time? Anybody else?
Yeah.
This is good. We can all break early.
So here's
great. Okay, Karma Finsuk, thank you so much.
Tsering, thank you for the wonderful talk. I fully agree with you about the more recent renderings of words like superstition. The Tibetan term Mongde, I think, is a very new invented term and doesn't really appear in old classical texts. Anyway, when you look at the Tibetan sort of reluctance to take up technology or secularism, is it partly because of the geographic isolation and the remoteness? Or is there something intrinsic in the Tibetan culture and civilization that makes them more sort of religious, less secular, more orthodox, spiritual, less technology-oriented? In case of Bhutan, to give you an example, I often say that if Bhutan were placed west of Nepal or Sikkim, we'd have gone through more Indianization and Westernization than Sikkim and Nepal. Yeah. It was the geographic location that helped.
No, I have a sort of very interesting things about Bhutan and Tibet. And so if I say that Tibetans were so angry, they'll beat me up. And I always say, Ganden Bhutan was never founded as an independent state regime, and it was all regime founded under Mongol Qing patronage. And I say Shabtung was always founded as an independent state, and that's why Bhutan continues to be independent. Bhutan didn't have any patron in the history of its history. Bhutan was Bhutan. It didn't have its Mongol or Qing patron in that sense. So it was always founded as an independent state, and that's why it continues to do so. As Tibet had a very particularly Ganden Bhutan wasn't founded as an independent state. So that's really, it's very offensive to Tibetans, pleasing to Bhutan. And now, idea of geography, I'm not into sort of ecological determination of religious beliefs, idea somehow, it's very popular during the Victorian period, idea somehow Tibet's high mountains and the might of this made them always superstitious or something like that. In this ecological, there is a fundamental difference is Tibetan Buddhism is, I always say, instead of being fractured by questioned, constant, each empire meets Tibetan, it strengthens Tibetan faith. See, Mongols could have easily fractured the Tibetan Buddhism and thrown it into pieces, but they adopted Tibetan Buddhism, and Tibetan Buddhism said, look, so we are right, see. And today, in the 21st century, 20th century, the Western can also fracture the Tibetan Buddhism. But no, you all begin to love Tibetan Buddhism, and you go crazy about Tibetan Buddhism. So again, Tibetan Buddhism is sort of, look, see, we're right. So, this is one, Tibetan Buddhism doesn't get fractured or impacted because each empire meets seems to adopt Tibetan Buddhism, appropriates Tibetan Buddhism. And this is what about empire and faith I want to talk about, that where Buddhism has impact, whereas all other religions suffers tremendous trauma because of rise of Islam is facing it, Christianity faces it, every religion faces that trauma impact of a greater civilization, but Tibetan Buddhism doesn't. That's, I think, it's the reason. Because each empire which encounters seems to find something attractive in Tibetan Buddhism and accept it in that way. It's never questioned, the Tibetan Buddhism. Either we took it either in terms of Shangri-La, or it's in terms of this sort of stripping of Buddhism into, say, rational science. That's two processes. Both have to strengthen Tibetan Buddhism. And Tibetan Buddhists have far more confidence now than ever before.